Forget everything those Hollywood epics and glossy History Channel specials fed you about ancient Egypt. You know, the stuff with sculpted pharaohs sighing dramatically at ethereal queens, their love stories blossoming like lotus flowers on the Nile. That's a load of sun-baked papyrus, a dusty delusion you've been sold for generations. Because tonight, we're peeling back the linen wraps, sniffing out the truth, and I promise you, it smells less of fragrant oils and more like, well, we'll get there. This isn't a journey into romance, folks. This is a descent into the grimy, lust-soaked reality of a civilization obsessed with control, procreation, and keeping the bloodline so pure it became a grotesque genetic joke. If you came here for a heartwarming tale of eternal devotion, you're in the wrong tomb. What you're about to get is a raw, unflinching look at why falling in love in ancient Egypt wouldn't just break your heart. It would probably break your hymen, your back, and your spirit, often in that precise order. Sound romantic? It wasn't. Let me know what shocked you most, because trust me, there's plenty to choose from. Let's start with the fundamental myth. Egyptian society, often painted as this enlightened beacon of civilization, was actually a brutal, often casually cruel engine of procreation, driven by the ceaseless throb of inheritance and the rank stink of social obligation. You think marriage was about starry-eyed glances and whispered vows? Please, that's a modern fantasy wrapped in a pretty bow. In ancient Egypt, the moment you could effectively stand upright and not soil yourself, you were a viable piece of the procreative puzzle. Girls were often married off before their breasts had even begun to swell, sometimes as young as 12 or 13, practically children themselves. Boys weren't far behind, pushed into arrangements that had less to do with affection and everything to do with land, lineage, and the relentless production of more bodies for the fields, the army, or the administrative machinery of the state. Your personal desires? They ranked somewhere below the pharaoh's morning bowel movement in terms of societal importance. You were a vessel, a cog, a fertile field to be tilled. Did you think you had a choice in this grim arrangement? A naive, ridiculous notion, isn't it? The concept of choice was for the gods, perhaps, or for the pharaoh when he decided which sister or daughter to defile for the sake of divine purity. For everyone else, it was simply a matter of enduring, of surrendering to the biological imperative and the rigid structures of power that dictated every pulse of your existence. The warmth of a hand, the comfort of a shared glance, these were fleeting luxuries, if they existed at all, dwarfed by the looming specter of duty and the ever-present threat of shame if you dared to stray from the path. You belonged to your family, then to your husband, then to the state, and always, always to the overarching, suffocating need for continuation, for legacy, for the next generation to sweat and toil just as you had. This wasn't a society built on individual happiness. It was a pyramid built on the backs of fertile bodies, stacked high and heavy with the weight of expectation. Any notion of love as a foundation was just that, a brittle, easily shattered illusion, a whisper lost in the clamor of necessity. And what did this early, forced union entail? Not gentle exploration, I assure you. The act was a duty, a biological transaction, often performed in a dusty, dimly lit corner of a mud-brick home, devoid of anything resembling tenderness. A young girl, barely out of childhood herself, was suddenly expected to open her body, to become a vessel for her husband's seed. Imagine the terror, the confusion, the sheer physical discomfort. There was no pretense of consent in the modern sense. It was an unspoken assumption, a given as fundamental as the rising sun or the flooding of the Nile. The pressure to conceive, and to conceive quickly, was immense. A barren woman was a stain, a curse, a withered branch on the family tree. Her value plummeted faster than a pharaoh's popularity after a failed harvest. She faced not just social ostracism, but the very real threat of repudiation, of being cast aside for a more fertile replacement. Her existence, her entire identity, was tied to her womb's ability to throb with new life. If it failed, she was nothing, utterly worthless. Her purpose, her very reason for being, evaporated into the harsh desert air. The emotional consequences were devastating, a slow, agonizing crawl through a life stripped of dignity. And this wasn't just about heirs for the elite. For the vast majority, for the farmers and laborers, More children meant more hands for the fields, more mouths to feed, but also more potential to secure their meager status, to ensure someone would care for them in their inevitable decrepitude. It was a bleak calculus of survival, where individual suffering was merely a footnote to the larger, brutal narrative of societal propagation. The intimacy, if you can even call it that, was a crude instrument of the state, not a tender connection between two souls. It was a transaction, a forced opening, a surrender to an unyielding current of expectation and biological imperative, leaving behind only the bitter taste of duty. The very word love likely held a different resonance, a grittier, more pragmatic meaning. It wasn't the grand, sweeping emotion celebrated in Western ballads. It was perhaps a quiet understanding forged through shared toil, a resignation to a common fate, or the fleeting comfort found in a moment of companionship amidst the relentless grind of existence. But to equate it with the passionate, romantic love of today is to misunderstand the very fabric of their world. Their love was built on the foundation of utility, on the mutual benefit of survival and procreation. Did couples sometimes find affection? Perhaps in the quiet moments between forced intimacy and relentless labor. Did they develop bonds of respect, even fondness? It's not impossible. Humans are adaptable creatures, capable of finding solace even in the most barren emotional landscapes. But these were byproducts, not the driving force. The driving force was the fertile womb, the strong back, the ability to contribute to the family unit and, by extension, to the continuity of a civilization obsessed with legacy. The pharaoh himself, despite his divine status, was not exempt from this brutal reality. His love life was a meticulously choreographed affair of political alliances, dynastic necessity, and the need to produce a suitable heir, preferably a son, to ensure the smooth transition of power. He might have dozens of wives and concubines, each a pawn in a larger game of power and influence. His emotional attachments were secondary, if they existed at all, to the cold, hard calculus of securing his throne and cementing his divine lineage. Any genuine warmth or tenderness was a luxury, a rare indulgence, overshadowed by the ever-present demands of the state. Even the art, the intricate tomb paintings and sculptures that survive today, often misleads us. We see tender depictions of couples, hands entwined, or families gathered. We interpret these through our modern, romantic lens. But were they expressions of deep, abiding affection, or idealized representations of societal order, of the perfect, fertile family unit, as it should be, rather than as it often was? More likely the latter. These were status symbols, declarations of proper conduct, not intimate snapshots of genuine emotion. They were propaganda, designed to project an image of harmony and fecundity, both for the living and for the gods. The stark reality was likely far more messy, more fraught with tension, resentment, and the quiet despair of lives lived by rote, fulfilling predetermined roles. A husband could take multiple wives, of course, adding to his collection of reproductive assets as his wealth and status grew. And while a wife might have certain legal rights, these were often theoretical, easily trampled underfoot by a dominant husband or the prevailing social norms. Her voice, her desires, her very self, were subsumed by the machinery of procreation and social expectation. To imagine yourself a strong, independent woman navigating the complexities of ancient Egyptian love would be to sign up for a lifetime of crushing disappointment, of silent tears shed in the dark, of endless subservience to a system that saw you primarily as a biological resource. You were a baby factory, a domestic laborer, a silent shadow in a world designed by and for men, utterly dependent on their whims, their desires, and their often brutal assertions of power. Your body was not your own. It was a tool, a means to an end, subject to inspection and evaluation, its worth measured solely by its output. And let's not even begin to ponder the concept of true intimacy, the kind that blossoms from vulnerability and mutual respect. How could that flourish in a society where child marriage was commonplace, where a woman's worth was calculated by her fertility, and where the constant threat of disease, famine, and violence loomed over every life? There was no space, no emotional oxygen for such delicate growth. Instead, there was the hardened shell of survival, the pragmatic understanding of what was required to simply be, to simply continue. This was not a world of soft touches and whispered confessions, but of raw necessity and brutal efficiency. The pharaoh might have his concubines, his endless supply of bodies to satisfy his divine urges, but even that was a display of power, a performance of virility, rather than an exploration of genuine connection. The women in his harem were pawns, commodities to be traded, used, and discarded at his whim. Their lives were a gilded cage, filled with silent rivalries and the gnawing anxiety of falling out of favor. Imagine the psychological toll, the constant performance, the forced smiles, the endless striving for a flicker of recognition from a man who saw you as little more than a living doll. The ultimate bleak reflection? The ancient Egyptians built monumental pyramids, invented complex writing systems, and developed sophisticated astronomical knowledge. But when it came to human connection, especially between men and women, they often remained in the dark ages of raw, unvarnished utility. Their legacy of lust and procreation stands tall, but the tomb of genuine affection remains utterly, terribly empty. You were just another cog in their grand, grinding machine, expected to play your part, to bleed on cue, to produce on demand, and to vanish quietly when your biological purpose was served. The silence, the lack of recorded personal sentiment, speaks volumes. Moving beyond the harsh realities of conjugal life, let's wade into the truly murky waters, the erotic economy of the Nile. Because if you thought relationships were solely about familial duty, you clearly haven't considered the sheer, overwhelming force of religious imperative. In ancient Egypt, everything, and I mean everything, was intertwined with the divine. And the divine, as it turns out, had a rather voracious appetite for, well, let's just say for fertility, and the physical manifestations thereof. This wasn't just about making babies. This was about ensuring the continued flooding of the Nile, the bounty of the harvest, the very cosmic order itself. And how did one appease these sexually charged deities? Often, by mirroring their perceived desires, or by offering up the very things they were thought to crave, acts of procreation, symbols of virility, and sometimes the actual bodies of those dedicated to their service. So forget the quiet, somber temples you see in the movies. These were often vibrant, bustling centers of life, commerce, and yes, even rituals that would make your modern sensibilities choke on their organic kombucha. The lines between the sacred and the frankly salacious were blurrier than a drunk priest's vision after too much fermented barley beer. You want to talk about gods who throb with power? The Egyptians made it literal. Consider the fertility cults. These weren't subtle affairs. Phallic symbols were everywhere, not hidden away in dusty museums, but prominently displayed, carried in processions. Worship. Min, the god of fertility and male potency, was often depicted with an erect penis, not as an artistic flourish, but as a literal, unmistakable declaration of his power to create life. Women would flock to his festivals, seeking his blessing, often participating in rites that were overtly sexual in nature, designed to channel his raw, generative energy. We're talking about rituals that involved a lot of moaning, a lot of gyrating, and a powerful, visceral connection to the earth and its cycles. It was less about spiritual transcendence and more about practical, earthy fecundity. Imagine a massive public gathering, a frenzied explosion of bodies and chants, all designed to invoke the most fundamental act of creation. Sound like a rave? Only if the rave ended with everyone hoping to get pregnant. The priests, of course, were the intermediaries, the facilitators of this divine connection. They were the ones who interpreted the god's desires, who performed the rites, and who, in some instances, may have even participated in acts designed to literally seed the land, or its people, with divine essence. This wasn't some abstract concept of blessing. It was about getting down and dirty, about manifesting the sacred through the profane. The temples weren't just places of prayer. They were conduits for raw, untamed power, often expressed through the very same biological mechanisms that kept their society churning. And what about the temple prostitutes? Or the sacred dancers? Or the women dedicated to certain cults? Their role was often deeply ambiguous. existing at the blurred intersection of religious devotion and overt sexual service. They weren't necessarily considered sinful in the same way modern morality might judge them. Instead, they were seen as instruments of the divine, their bodies consecrated to the gods, their acts facilitating the flow of cosmic energy. It was a transaction, yes, but one imbued with spiritual significance, a sacred offering. Their bodies, however, were not their own. They were tools, consecrated vessels, used to appease, to invoke, to ensure the prosperity of the land. Their dignity, their individual desires, were secondary to the greater religious imperative. And let's be blunt, the line between sacred duty and exploitation was undoubtedly thin, if it existed at all. A young woman, dedicated to a temple cult, might find herself performing acts that were less about spiritual enlightenment and more about satisfying the carnal appetites of priests or powerful patrons, all under the thinly veiled guise of religious observance. The power dynamics were stark, the vulnerability immense. To be a god's wife, or a divine adoratress, might have conferred status, but it also meant a life dictated by rigid rules and expectations, often involving severe restrictions on personal autonomy, particularly when it came to their own bodies and their own intimate lives. They were owned, in a very real sense, by the divine, and by extension, by the powerful male figures who interpreted the divine will. The pharaoh himself was often seen as a living god, a direct manifestation of divine power on earth. His procreative acts, therefore, were not merely personal, they were cosmic. Every intimate encounter, every child born of his loins, was an act of divine creation, a guarantee of cosmic order. This is why the royal harems were not just places of pleasure but vital engines of state, producing the next generation of potential heirs, securing alliances through marriage, and showcasing the pharaoh's virility and divine favor. The women within these gilded cages were the ultimate pawns in this grand, erotic game of power. Their bodies were their currency, their fertility their value. They lived in a constant state of competition, vying for the pharaoh's attention, desperate to bear him a son, their only hope for security and influence. The envy, the betrayal, the quiet desperation that must have festered within those luxurious walls. It's a horror story waiting to be told. Imagine being one among hundreds, your entire existence revolving around the fleeting attention of a man who saw you as little more than a womb on legs. The opulent surroundings would barely mask the emotional decay, the slow, agonizing surrender of self. This wasn't about love, folks. This was about power, about control, about using the most primal human urges to maintain a rigid social order and to ensure the eternal continuity of a divine monarchy. The rituals, the offerings, the very structure of their intimate lives, it all pointed back to this singular, relentless objective. Sex was a tool, a sacred duty, a political weapon, rarely, if ever, a spontaneous expression of affection or desire. The bodily details, the sweat, the moan, the throb of life all were subservient to the larger, colder mechanics of state and religious power. When you think of ancient Egypt, stop picturing Cleopatra's seductive eyes. Start picturing a priest, chanting over a ritual phallus, while a young woman, her face a mask of forced serenity, offers up her body to appease a god who demands not love, but fecundity. It's a bleak, utilitarian kind of sensuality, stripped of genuine connection, leaving only the rank smell of obligation and the quiet despair of a soul consumed by the relentless machinery of procreation. The harvest of bodies was as crucial as the harvest of wheat, and both were cultivated with the same ruthless efficiency, demanding tribute, demanding surrender. Now, let's talk about bodies. Not the idealized, perfectly preserved ones you see in museums, but the real, living, breathing, oozing, sometimes horrifyingly sick bodies that populated ancient Egypt. Because if you think the love life was complicated, wait till you hear about the health practices, especially when it came to anything below the waist. Fertility wasn't just a societal expectation, it was a desperate, life or death obsession. And the methods employed to ensure it, or to prevent it, or to cure its absence, were often as baffling as they were frankly disgusting. Forget your modern gynecological examinations. This was ancient medicine. powered by superstition, a rudimentary understanding of anatomy, and a whole lot of desperate hope. The very concept of hygiene was, let's just say, less than meticulous, especially when it came to the more intimate areas. The prevalence of parasites, infections, and sexually transmitted diseases was likely rampant, turning any intimate encounter into a roll of the dice with your own health. And the remedies? Oh, they were a special kind of nightmare. Imagine a woman struggling to conceive, or suffering from some unnamed affliction of her reproductive organs. Her options weren't exactly vast. Medical papyri reveal a truly grotesque pharmacopoeia. We're talking about concoctions involving crocodile dung, fermented bread, sour milk, honey, and a delightful array of animal parts, all mixed into pastes, pessaries, or potions to be inserted, ingested, or smeared onto the afflicted areas. You want to talk about anatomical precision? They tried, bless their hearts, but their understanding of how things worked was primitive. A hygiene routine might involve squatting over a steaming bowl of herbs, or douching with fermented liquids. The smell alone would be enough to induce nausea, let alone the actual efficacy, or lack thereof, of these pungent treatments. The risk of infection, already high, would only be exacerbated by these unsanitary practices. And if you think this sounds bad for women, men had their own set of delightful woes, though perhaps less invasive. Impotence was a grave concern, robbing a man of his virility and, by extension, his status. Remedies for that might involve grinding up various animal organs, consuming mixtures intended to strengthen the seed, or engaging in rituals designed to restore vigor. The lengths they would go to, the filth they would ingest or smear, just to satisfy the relentless demand for procreation, it speaks volumes about the societal pressure. Contraception was equally inventive. We're not talking about anything remotely reliable. Think along the lines of crocodile dung, mixed with honey and natron, shaped into a kind of pessary, to be inserted into the vagina. The idea was that the acidity and stickiness would somehow block or kill sperm. The reality? More likely to cause a raging infection and a rather pungent odor, while doing very little to prevent pregnancy. Other methods included soaking rags in acacia gum and inserting them, or consuming magical potions. The efficacy was dubious at best, which likely led to many unplanned pregnancies and a high degree of maternal mortality. The constant cycle of conception, childbirth, and the inherent dangers of both meant that women's bodies were perpetually at risk, perpetually stressed, and perpetually under the scrutiny of their family and community. Her womb was not her own. It was a public utility, a generator of potential heirs, and its output was relentlessly monitored. The trauma of repeated, often failed, pregnancies, the loss of children to disease, the constant physical burden. It must have been a relentless, exhausting existence, stripping away any vestige of comfort or personal autonomy. This wasn't just a physical struggle, it was an emotional one, a quiet, desperate battle for survival against the relentless demands of biology and society. And what about the sheer audacity of certain practices that blurred the lines between medicine and pure charlatanism? The leeching priest, for instance, or the ritualistic cutting and bleeding, believed to purge evil humors or recalibrate the body's balance. Sometimes, these treatments involved direct, invasive procedures, performed with crude tools, under conditions that would make a modern surgeon weep with horror. Imagine a toothache, or a festering wound, or an internal ailment, and the only cure involved someone poking around with unsterilized instruments, muttering incantations, and applying pastes made from unknown substances. The pain, the risk of secondary infection, the sheer indignity of it paints a grim picture. And when these cures failed, as they often did, the blame was rarely placed on the inadequacy of the treatment. Instead, it was attributed to an angry god, a malevolent spirit, or the patient's own moral failings. The shame, the public exposure of one's physical ailments, particularly those related to the intimate parts of the body, added another layer of suffering. You were not just sick, you were potentially cursed, or worse, deemed unworthy. The constant battle against disease and mortality shaped every aspect of their lives, including their intimate ones. Short lifespans meant a desperate scramble to produce heirs as quickly as possible. The loss of a child was a common tragedy, but one that had profound implications for the parents, particularly the mother, whose failure to produce a living heir could have devastating consequences for her status and security. The raw, unfiltered pain of repeated loss, the physical toll of multiple pregnancies and births, combined with the crushing societal pressure, meant that the female body was a site of constant struggle, a battleground where life and death played out with brutal regularity. The fragility of existence, the ever-present shadow of the tomb, colored every interaction, every intimate act. There was no escaping the bleak reality of their physical forms, subject to decay, disease, and the relentless demands of procreation. So, when you look at those serene Egyptian statues, remember the reality: the unwashed bodies, the festering sores, the pungent remedies, the silent suffering behind the stoic expressions. The desire to conceive, to merely survive long enough to perpetuate the species, often trumped any notion of pleasure, comfort, or even basic dignity. It was a visceral, often unpleasant, reminder that the flesh was weak, and the will of the gods, or society, was absolute. The bodily details, the ooze, the sweat, the throb of fever, these were the true, intimate realities, far removed from any romantic ideal. Let's descend further into the murky depths of Egyptian society, specifically focusing on the ultimate power play: women as property. Forget any illusions of gender equality. The concept would have been met with blank stares, perhaps even outright derision. While Egyptian women certainly had more legal rights than, say, their Greek counterparts, these were largely theoretical, easily overridden by the brutal realities of power, wealth, and the sheer force of male dominance. The harem, a feature of royal and aristocratic households, was not a place of soft silks and whispered secrets between equals. It was a well-oiled machine for producing heirs and securing alliances, and the women within it were, to put it bluntly, livestock. Prized breeding stock, perhaps, but livestock nonetheless. Their lives were meticulously controlled, their movements restricted, their very existence revolving around the whims of the pharaoh or noble who owned them. Their bodies were not their own. They were a resource, a commodity, to be used, traded, or discarded at will. And the emotional journey? A slow, agonizing crawl from youthful innocence to a hardened, cynical resignation, fueled by silent rivalries and the gnawing anxiety of being superseded. Imagine being brought into the harem, a young girl, perhaps plucked from a provincial family, or a gift from a foreign dignitary, or even a daughter of a lesser noble, now thrust into a world of opulent confinement. Your value was tied directly to your beauty and, more importantly, your potential fertility. You were assessed, inspected, probably subjected to a hymenal inspection, to determine your purity and suitability. Your body became a public spectacle, a piece of meat on display, its worth determined by its physical attributes. There was no privacy, no personal space, certainly no emotional refuge. Every other woman in the harem was a potential rival, vying for the same limited resource: the pharaoh's attention, his seed, his favor. The constant performance, the forced smiles, the exquisite clothes designed to hide the gnawing emptiness within it was a gilded cage of psychological torment. And if you were lucky enough to bear a child, particularly a son, your status might rise, offering a fleeting moment of security. But that security was precarious, dependent on the child's survival, and the pharaoh's continued favor. Failed to produce a healthy heir, or worse, produce only daughters, and your value plummeted. You became a discarded vessel, relegated to the periphery, your life a testament to your perceived biological failure. This wasn't just about the pharaoh's harem, though that was the pinnacle of female commodification. The concept permeated all levels of society. For the common woman, her body was a vital, often overworked tool for domestic labor and endless childbearing. Her husband might take multiple wives if he could afford them, each one adding to his household's productive capacity. The wife was a co-worker, a breeder, a manager of the domestic sphere, but rarely an equal partner in any emotional sense. Her worth was tied to her utility, her ability to maintain the household and produce heirs. If she became infertile or chronically ill, Her husband had every right to cast her aside, to seek a more fertile replacement. The shame, the public exposure of such a repudiation would be devastating. She would be left with nothing, stripped of her identity, her purpose, her very means of survival. This casual acceptance of female disposability, this relentless focus on a woman's reproductive capacity as her primary value, was a deeply entrenched aspect of their culture. It stripped women of their individuality, reducing them to biological functions, to vessels for the male lineage. And then there were the temple priestesses, or the divine adoratrices, particularly in the later periods. While they held significant power and status, their roles were still deeply intertwined with sexual symbolism, and often literal ritualistic chastity. They were dedicated to the gods, serving as their earthly representatives, often performing sacred rites that echoed procreative acts. While they might have held immense spiritual authority, their personal lives, especially their sexual lives, were often rigidly controlled. They were sometimes forbidden from marriage or childbearing, their virginity preserved for symbolic purposes, or their bodies consecrated to a spiritual union that precluded a physical one. This wasn't about personal choice. It was about serving a higher, often inscrutable purpose. Their bodies became symbols, not instruments of personal pleasure or connection. To be a priestess meant to sacrifice personal autonomy, to become a living icon, a representation of divine purity or fecundity. The psychological toll of such a life, where your intimate self was constantly subsumed by a public symbolic role, must have been immense. The power reversals, when they occurred, were rare and often brutal. A queen might wield immense power, but it was often through her male relatives, a son, a brother, a husband. If she stepped outside those boundaries, she risked a swift and often violent downfall. Cleopatra, for all her legendary allure, was a political animal, using her sexuality as a weapon to secure power in a male-dominated world. Her beauty was a tool, not a source of genuine connection. Even for the most powerful women, their existence was often a tightrope walk, constantly navigating the treacherous currents of male authority and societal expectation. The constant threat of public exposure, of humiliation, of being stripped naked both literally and figuratively, loomed over every woman, regardless of her status. The emotional triggers were raw: shame, public exposure, exploitation, intimacy, as control. There was no hero arc, no triumph of the individual spirit, only cycles of lust, power, and punishment played out on the bodies of women, reduced to their biological functions, their desires ignored, their spirits slowly crushed under the weight of relentless patriarchal control. Their survival was often a bitter one, achieved through silence, through submission, through the slow, agonizing erosion of their own sense of self. Let's plunge deeper into the genetic cesspool of ancient Egyptian royalty. Because if you thought the general population had it rough, just wait until you hear about the pharaohs themselves. The very idea of falling in love with a royal? That's not just a pipe dream. It's a recipe for a grotesque genetic lottery, and a life dictated by the ultimate burden: incest. Forget Romeo and Juliet. We're talking about siblings marrying siblings, fathers marrying daughters, uncles marrying nieces, not because of burning passion, but because of a concept so deeply ingrained it beggars belief: the divine right to keep the bloodline pure, or, as they interpreted it, to keep the divine essence within the family, unpolluted by the common rabble. The logic was simple, if horrifying. Pharaohs were gods, and gods marry other gods. And since the only other gods available were their immediate family members, well, you can see where this train wreck of a family tree was heading. It was less about romance and more about a brutal, genetic Game of Thrones played out in the royal bedchamber. The physical consequences? Oh, they were a visual feast of horror. Take, for example, the legendary Akhenaten and Nefertiti, often portrayed as a loving couple in modern media. Their relationship, like so many royal pairings, was almost certainly incestuous. Akhenaten himself had a physically unusual appearance, often attributed to the inbreeding that plagued his family line, and his son, the infamous Tutankhamun, a walking, breathing testament to the perils of centuries of inbreeding. DNA analysis of his remains has revealed a horrifying litany of deformities and diseases: a clubfoot, a severe limp requiring a cane, scoliosis, and a nasty case of malaria that likely pushed him over the edge. His parents, brother and sister, their children, the royal offspring, were born into a world where their bodies were a ticking time bomb of genetic defects. They were physically vulnerable, often frail, prone to illness, and likely suffered chronic pain, all for the sake of a misguided notion of purity. Imagine being born into that lineage, knowing that your very existence was a cruel gamble with your own body, a sacrifice on the altar of divine heritage. The pressure to produce healthy heirs, despite these inherent genetic limitations, must have been immense, a suffocating weight of expectation for the royal couple. The sacred duty of incest wasn't just about preserving divine blood, it was also about consolidating power. Marrying within the immediate family prevented rival factions from gaining influence through marriage alliances. It kept wealth and power concentrated in the hands of a select few. It was a cold, calculated strategy, masking its brutal pragmatism with the veil of religious imperative. The queen, in such a marriage, was not just a consort. She was a sister, a daughter, a mother, and always a royal incubator. Her role was to provide the next generation of pure pharaohs, even if that meant sacrificing her own physical well-being and the health of her offspring. Her life was a constant performance of piety and fertility, a grotesque masquerade designed to perpetuate a system that ultimately consumed its own children. And the emotional toll, the utter lack of genuine affection, replaced by the forced smiles, the awkward intimacies with a sibling or a parent, the quiet despair of knowing your destiny was predetermined, your body a mere vessel for a flawed lineage. This wasn't a family. It was a breeding program. Consider the children born of these unions. Many likely died in infancy or early childhood, weakened by genetic predispositions. Those who survived often carried visible burdens, physical anomalies that would have been obvious even to the casual observer. Yet, they were still revered as divine, their imperfections overlooked or attributed to mystical reasons. The public perception was carefully managed, of course, but the reality for the royal family must have been a constant, gnawing anxiety about the health and viability of their heirs. And imagine the shame, the public exposure of these physical weaknesses, should they become too prominent to ignore. The desire to maintain secrecy, to project an image of divine perfection, would have been paramount, adding another layer of pressure and emotional suppression to an already fraught existence. This cycle of inbreeding continued for centuries, perpetuating a line of pharaohs who were increasingly fragile, increasingly burdened by the very purity they sought to maintain. It's a stark, horrifying example of how an extreme pursuit of power and perceived divine right can lead to self-destruction. Literally, the blood that flowed through their veins, supposedly sacred and pure, was actually a poisoned chalice, carrying the seeds of their own physical decay. The legacy of these royal incestuous unions is not one of romantic devotion, but of genetic horror, of human bodies warped and weakened by centuries of misguided aspiration. It's a bleak reflection on the true cost of power, a reminder that the most exalted figures can be the most profoundly shackled by their own traditions. Their love life was an echo chamber of biological necessity, a constant, often painful reminder that their bodies, like their kingdom, were crumbling from within, all in the name of a purity that proved to be a curse. The cyclical nature of lust and power, manifested in the very DNA of their rulers, ended not in triumph, but in the sad, limping reality of King Tut, a tragic pawn in a game he was genetically destined to lose. If you thought being a royal was a raw deal in ancient Egypt, just wait until we crawl into the truly dark underbelly, the lives of servants, slaves, and the countless individuals for whom intimacy was not a luxury or even a brutal duty, but a casual, brutal form of exploitation. Forget any notions of agency or personal choice. For these souls, their bodies were not their own. They were tools, commodities, utterly subjected to the whims of their owners or superiors. Their existence was a stark contrast to the gilded illusions of the pharaohs, a constant struggle for survival where personal dignity was a forgotten concept and the threat of violence, both physical and sexual, loomed perpetually. This is where the emotional journey truly descends into horror, leaving only bleak reflection. There are no hero arcs here, only cycles of lust, power, and punishment, playing out in the dust and sweat of daily existence. Imagine being a slave, captured in a foreign land, or born into servitude. Your life, your labor, your very body belonged to another. You were property, no different from a donkey or a pot. Your master could dispose of you as he pleased, work you to death, or, more insidiously, use you for his own carnal pleasure. There was no recourse, no law to protect you from sexual assault or forced cohabitation. A slave woman might be compelled to become a concubine, a temporary plaything, or a breeder, her children automatically becoming slaves themselves. Her screams, her protests, would vanish unheard into the vast indifference of the desert. This wasn't about desire, it was about absolute power, the ultimate expression of control over another human being. The casualness of the abuse, the implicit acceptance that a master had the right to every aspect of his slave's being, including their body, is truly horrifying. The concept of consent, of personal boundaries, simply did not exist for these individuals. Their lives were a constant negotiation of terror and survival, a silent endurance of indignity. And this wasn't limited to chattel slavery. Even free servants, laborers, or peasants lived under a pervasive system of hierarchy, where their bodies were often seen as expendable. A powerful official might demand favors from a subordinate, leveraging his authority to compel compliance. A young woman working in a wealthy household might find herself vulnerable to the advances of her employer, her refusal risking not just her job, but her reputation and livelihood. The line between seduction and coercion, already blurry, effectively vanished when power was so unevenly distributed. The daily grind for survival meant that many were forced into situations where their bodies were used for purposes far removed from their own desires, simply to keep food on the table or a roof over their heads. The shame of public exposure, the quiet humiliation, the understanding that protesting meant even worse consequences. These were the silent burdens carried by countless individuals, their stories lost to time, their suffering unspoken. The very idea of a loving, consensual relationship for these people was a cruel joke. Their unions, if they existed, were often pragmatic arrangements, born of shared hardship, a desperate attempt to find solace in a world that offered little. Intimacy was a fragile thing, constantly under threat from the outside, subject to disruption by a master's whim or an official's decree. The cycles of exploitation, the casual references to abuse, were woven into the very fabric of their society. A power reversal scene for these individuals rarely involved them gaining agency. It often involved a master deciding to be benevolent for a day, offering a fleeting moment of respite before the inevitable return to servitude. Their conflict was simple: survival. Their resolution, often bitter survival, marked by the quiet endurance of indignity and the suppression of any genuine emotion. The constant pressure to survive, to provide for their families, often meant that choices were not choices at all, but forced submissions. A family might marry off a daughter to an older, wealthier man, not out of affection, but out of necessity, to secure their own economic stability. A young man might enter into a relationship he despised, simply because it offered a path to a better life, or protected his family from ruin. The personal cost was immense, a slow, agonizing erosion of the soul, a life lived without passion, without genuine connection, fueled only by the grim determination to see another sunrise. The emotional triggers for these individuals were visceral: shame, public exposure, exploitation, the chilling realization that intimacy itself could be a tool of control, a weapon wielded by those with power. They learned to survive through silence, through outward compliance, through the painful process of detaching from their own desires and emotions. Their lives were a stark, brutal reminder that in ancient Egypt, power was not just about ruling over land and people. It was about absolute dominion over the very bodies and souls of the less fortunate. Their experiences, marked by filth, ooze, throb of pain, and pervasive shame, offer the bleaker side of a history often whitewashed by romanticized imagery. Let's shift our morbid gaze from the daily grind to the ultimate long-term plan: sex, death, and the ancient Egyptian obsession with the afterlife. Because if you thought things got less bizarre once you were dead, you've clearly underestimated their dedication to eternal continuity, even if it involved a posthumous erection. The Egyptians didn't just believe in an afterlife, they meticulously prepared for it, often taking their earthly desires, and their more carnal ones, with them into the tomb. This wasn't about a spiritual ascension into some ethereal realm. It was about replicating the best bits of earthly existence, including, yes, procreation, fertility, and even a bit of erotic irony in the realm of the dead. The notion of a peaceful rest? Child, please. This was about ensuring you were eternally potent, eternally fertile, and eternally capable of indulging in whatever pleasures you desired, even if you were mummified and quite literally stiff. Their funerary rituals weren't just about sending the deceased off with reverence, they were about equipping them for an active, vibrant existence in the field of reeds, their version of paradise. And what did an active, vibrant existence entail? Often, a continuing need for fertility and procreation. This is why you find amulets of sexual organs, depictions of deities in explicit poses, and even actual phallic objects in tombs. The deceased, particularly the males, needed to be eternally potent to continue their lineage in the afterlife, or to ensure their continued prosperity. The idea was that the life force, tied intimately to sexual energy, would continue to flow even beyond the grave. So, while your body might be shriveled and wrapped in linen, your ethereal self was expected to be ready for action, eternally thrumming with the vigor of life. It's anatomical comedy taken to its most absurd, ultimate conclusion. The deceased, in their elaborate deathbeds, were practically signing up for an eternal Kama Sutra, without the benefit of a living, breathing partner. Consider the role of magical spells and texts found in tombs, like the Book of the Dead. Many of these weren't just about navigating the underworld or reciting prayers. Some contained incantations designed to ensure the deceased's virility, their ability to procreate in the afterlife, or their capacity for pleasure. They were essentially spiritual Viagra prescriptions, etched in stone and papyrus. The very concept of regeneration and rebirth was deeply intertwined with sexual symbolism. Osiris, the god of the underworld, was also a god of fertility, his resurrection inextricably linked to the potent act of procreation. So, if you wanted to be reborn, to have a thriving existence beyond the veil, you needed to make sure your posthumous sexual capabilities were top-notch. It was a rather blunt, no-nonsense approach to eternal life, far removed from abstract spiritual contemplation. It was about the continuation of raw, biological energy, even in death. And the bizarre items found in tombs? Not just gold and jewels, but sometimes overtly sexual talismans, figurines of nude women, phallic charms, and even objects that vaguely resembled dildos or fertility symbols. These weren't just decorative. They were functional, meant to empower the deceased, to ensure their continued potency and pleasure in the afterlife. Imagine a dead pharaoh, surrounded by his mummified pets and his eternal wealth, but also by a collection of objects designed to ensure his never-ending capacity for sexual acts. It's a darkly humorous juxtaposition, a testament to how deeply intertwined their earthly desires were with their aspirations for eternity. The concept of an eternal orgasm might be a stretch, but the underlying drive was certainly there. A desire for perpetual satisfaction, for the endless continuation of life's most primal pleasures, even when life itself had ceased. This fixation on posthumous sexuality wasn't just for the pharaohs or the elite. Common folk, too, hoped for a fertile afterlife, a continuation of their earthly existence, complete with the ability to produce offspring and enjoy physical comforts. Their simpler tombs might contain less elaborate versions of these same symbols, a humble attempt to secure eternal potency and comfort. It speaks to a profound belief that the body and its functions were not just temporary vessels for a fleeting spirit, but an integral part of the eternal soul. The physical, the carnal, the biological these were not to be shed upon death, but transformed, carried into the next realm, ensuring a continuous cycle of existence. The grim reality, of course, was that their bodies were slowly decaying in the dry desert air, their mummified remains mere shells of their former selves. But the belief, the fervent hope, that their lust and their life force would continue to throb beyond the grave, is a powerful, if somewhat unsettling testament to their worldview. It's a final, ironic punchline. Even in death, the Egyptians couldn't escape their obsession with sex and fertility. They took their carnal desires to the grave, hoping for an eternal, cosmic orgy, only to find themselves as dust, an eternal testament to their human, all too human, lust. The bleakness of it all, the desperate clinging to the physical even in the face of absolute cessation, offers a chilling reflection on their struggle against the inevitable. Now, let's peel back another layer of this sun-baked onion and examine the figures who truly held the reins of sexual control and social morality. The priests, the eunuchs, and the various guardians of what they defined as virtue, though it often felt more like vice. Forget any noble spiritual image of these individuals. In ancient Egypt, religious authority and power were often intertwined with the casual references to abuse, hierarchy, and outright hypocrisy. These were the gatekeepers of acceptable behavior, the interpreters of divine will, and often the wielders of immense unchecked power over the intimate lives of others. The power reversal scenes here are not about the oppressed rising up. They're about those in power reinforcing their dominance through subtle manipulation and overt coercion. The priests, for instance, were not merely spiritual guides. They were powerful figures, often wealthy landowners, administrators, and influencers who dictated not just religious rites but also social norms, including those related to marriage, divorce, and procreation. They interpreted omens, performed purification rituals, and officiated at ceremonies that directly impacted people's intimate lives. Their pronouncements carried immense weight, shaping public opinion and often dictating personal choices. A priest might declare a marriage unfavorable due to divine displeasure, or sanction a divorce, giving them immense leverage over families. Their authority, cloaked in divine legitimacy, allowed them to impose their will, often for their own benefit or to maintain the social order they favored. They were not exempt from the lust and power dynamics themselves, often living lives of luxury, surrounded by temple servants and, in some cases, women dedicated to their cults, whose devotion might easily blur into forced sexual servitude. The hypocrisy of a religious authority preaching chastity while indulging his own desires was likely a common, if unspoken, reality. Then there are the eunuchs. Not just a feature of later empires, eunuchs also played a role in ancient Egypt, particularly in the pharaoh's court and harem. Their primary purpose was to guard the royal women, to ensure the purity of the pharaoh's lineage by preventing any unauthorized impregnation. Imagine their lives, stripped of their virility, rendered safe by mutilation. Their very existence a stark testament to the pharaoh's possessiveness and paranoia. They were trusted precisely because they were perceived as unthreatening, incapable of challenging the pharaoh's dominion over his women. Yet, this trust came at an immense personal cost. These men, often foreign captives or individuals from lower social strata, were robbed of their masculinity, reduced to mere guardians of female bodies. Their presence in the harem served as a chilling reminder of the strict control exercised over royal women, a constant, silent threat against any perceived transgression. Their power was derived from their very emasculation, a perverse reversal where their impotence became their strength within the rigid hierarchy. The power of these figures, both priests and eunuchs, lay in their ability to observe, to enforce, and to judge. The concept of virtue became a tool for control, a means to shame and punish those who strayed from the prescribed path. A woman accused of adultery, for instance, might face public humiliation, even physical punishment, sanctioned by religious or judicial authorities. Her body, her reputation would be smeared, leaving her with nowhere to turn. The priests would be the ones to declare her actions sinful, to condemn her in the eyes of the gods and the community. The eunuchs would be the ones to ensure that the pharaoh's women remained pure, their very presence a constant surveillance. This was less about genuine moral guidance and more about maintaining order, about preventing social disruption, and about reinforcing the patriarchal structure of power. The control over intimacy, over female bodies was paramount. The casual references to abuse, to exploitation, to the pervasive hypocrisy of those in power, were simply facts of life. The religious institutions, far from being havens of spiritual purity, were often complicit in, or direct beneficiaries of, the sexual and social oppression that permeated Egyptian society. The priests, with their access to divine knowledge and their influence over the population, could manipulate belief to justify their own authority, including their control over people's intimate lives. They could demand offerings, exact tribute, and exert influence over marriages and family matters, all under the guise of divine will. It was a symbiotic relationship between spiritual authority and earthly power, feeding off the vulnerability and credulity of the populace. The throb of fear, the shame of public exposure, the quiet exploitation, these were the emotional triggers constantly at play, manipulated by those who stood at the intersection of religion and power. There was no escaping their watchful gaze, no truly private space where one could express genuine desire or forge a truly independent connection. Every aspect of intimate life was under scrutiny, subject to the judgment and control of the men who claimed to speak for the gods, or to protect the sacred bloodline. Now, let's talk about sex itself, but not the way you've probably imagined it. Forget your preconceptions about the Kama Sutra, with its intricate positions, and focus on mutual pleasure. When we talk about the Kama Sutra of the pharaohs, we're talking about something far more pragmatic, often brutally utilitarian, and almost entirely devoid of the romantic gloss you've been fed. This wasn't about exploring erotic delights for their own sake. It was primarily about procreation, ritual, or, for the elite, a display of power and virility. The casual references to abuse and hierarchy are not just background noise, they're the very melody of their intimate lives. The narrative architecture here isn't about building to a climax of pleasure. It's about escalating discomfort, a sensory overload that reveals the harsh realities of ancient Egyptian physicality and its profound lack of genuine connection. For the vast majority of Egyptians, sex was, first and foremost, about making babies. It was a biological imperative, a fundamental duty. The act itself was likely brief, functional, and devoid of much foreplay or elaborate technique. There was no time for lingering touches or whispered endearments when survival was a daily struggle and more hands were always needed for the fields. A fertile woman was a prize, a valuable asset, and her body was seen as a means to an end, producing heirs. The focus wasn't on her pleasure, but on her fertility. The anatomical precision applied here wasn't for enhancing sensation but for understanding conception, for rituals designed to ensure the womb was fruitful. It's an erotic irony that the culture credited with so much sophistication reduced the most intimate human act to a mere biological function, stripped of its emotional depth. For the elite, particularly the pharaoh, sex was a powerful tool of statecraft. His potency was directly linked to the prosperity of Egypt. His numerous wives and concubines were not objects of affection, but political pawns, their bodies used to forge alliances, secure loyalty, and, most importantly, produce a suitable heir. The act itself became a performance, a demonstration of virility and divine favor. The pleasure derived was often less about mutual delight, and more about the satisfaction of conquering, of exercising dominion. The scenes of intimacy would have been carefully orchestrated, perhaps even observed, by attendants or eunuchs, stripping away any last vestiges of privacy or genuine connection. It was a transaction, a cold exchange of bodies and status, far removed from anything resembling love. The throb of power, not passion, was the driving force. Consider the role of public nudity and sexual imagery. While we see depictions of nudes in Egyptian art, they were rarely about titillation or individual eroticism. They were often symbolic, representations of fertility goddesses, depictions of ritual acts, or illustrations of the human form in its raw, unadorned state. Nudity wasn't inherently shameful, but it wasn't necessarily about personal pleasure either. It was functional, symbolic, a visual shorthand for concepts like fecundity, rebirth, or the raw power of the gods. A dancer in a temple might perform provocatively, but her performance was part of a ritual, not a personal invitation. The sensual overload created by these images and performances was designed to evoke a visceral response related to the divine, not necessarily to individual arousal or desire. The casual references to abuse and hierarchy are woven into these intimate acts. A servant or slave might be compelled to perform sexual acts, not out of desire, but out of fear for their life or livelihood. A wife might endure her husband's advances, even if they were crude or violent, because she had no other choice. The concept of consent, as we understand it, was largely absent, replaced by a system where power dictated access to bodies. Intimacy as control was a pervasive theme, where the act of sex became a means of asserting dominance, of reinforcing the social order. There was no sense of a shared journey, no vulnerability, only the cold, hard reality of submission. The ultimate tragedy is the lack of genuine connection, the absence of any true tenderness or passion in these portrayals of intimate life. The Egyptians built monumental structures, developed complex systems of governance, and created a rich artistic tradition. Yet, when it came to the most fundamental human connection, they often reduced it to a raw, utilitarian exchange. Their Kama Sutra was a manual for procreation, for power, for ritual, for everything but the kind of deep, empathetic bond that truly defines human love. The sexual horror, the grotesque escalation of exploitation, the myth-puncturing reality of their intimate lives, it all points to a stark, cynical truth. There was no hero arc here, no triumph of love over adversity, only cycles of lust, power, and punishment, played out on bodies that were seen as little more than instruments, disposable tools in the grand, grinding machine of Egyptian society. The moaning, the sweat, the smear of bodily fluid saw part of a grim, mechanical process, devoid of genuine human warmth, leaving only a bleak, empty reflection. We've explored the mummified myths, the erotic economies, the truly nauseating medicine, the commodification of women, the grotesque incest of royalty, and the sheer brutality faced by slaves. Now, let's finally piece together the ultimate, bleak legacy of lust and dust that defines ancient Egypt's intimate history. Because if you came here hoping to find some hidden wellspring of romantic love, some tender whisper of affection that survived the millennia, you're about to leave utterly parched. This wasn't a society built on grand passions. It was a brutal, pragmatic machine, fueled by the relentless demands of procreation, power, and a rigid social hierarchy. The conflict was always sexual or status-based oppression, and the resolution, almost always emotional or physical humiliation, or the bitterest kind of survival. There are no hero arcs here, just endless, grinding cycles of lust, power, and punishment. The grand narrative of ancient Egypt, for all its splendor and technological marvels, is a story of bodies. Bodies born, bodies worked, bodies used, bodies discarded, and bodies prepared for an afterlife that was itself a continuation of earthly, carnal desires. The love that existed was a functional, utilitarian construct, a pragmatic agreement between families or a cold calculation of royal lineage. It was about perpetuating the species, securing property, and maintaining the social order. Any genuine affection that might have blossomed between individuals was a rare, fragile bloom, constantly threatened by the harsh realities of disease, early death, and the ever-present demands of duty. This wasn't a world where you married for love. You married for progeny, for land, for survival. Your desires, your emotional needs, were irrelevant footnotes to the larger, brutal narrative of societal propagation. The shame of infertility, the public exposure of a broken marriage, the exploitation of the vulnerable, these were the constant, gnawing realities, stripping away any pretense of personal autonomy or dignity. The erotic irony of it all is profound. A civilization obsessed with fertility, with the power of procreation, with ensuring the continuity of life even into the afterlife, managed to strip the very act of its intimacy, its pleasure, its profound human connection. Sex became a tool, a sacred duty, a political weapon, rarely, if ever, a spontaneous expression of desire or a tender act of mutual affection. The anatomical comedy of their health practices, the casual references to abuse in the harems, the grotesque escalation of inbreeding among the royals, all serve to highlight the chilling reality that human bodies were often seen as mere instruments, to be used, controlled, and discarded at will. The throb of life, the moist smear of bodily fluids, the moan of pleasure or pain, these visceral realities were ultimately subsumed by the cold mechanics of power and societal expectation. And what about the shifting narrators, the you and they, that have guided us through this descent? It's a constant reminder that these weren't just abstract historical figures, these were real people, with real bodies and real, albeit often brutally suppressed, emotions. The curiosity that might have drawn you in, the disgust that might have churned in your stomach, the amusement at the sheer absurdity, and the horror at the inherent cruelty, all lead to this final, bleak reflection. There is no triumph here, no great love story to tell, only cycles. The lust for power leading to incest, the lust for heirs leading to child brides, the lust for control leading to the systematic exploitation of women and slaves. And the punishment? It was often self-inflicted, a genetic curse, a life of silent suffering, or a death in obscurity, leaving behind only dust and the lingering rank smell of human ambition untamed. The ultimate lesson from ancient Egypt's intimate history is a stark one. Love was a luxury, not a given, and often, it was a trap. It was a dangerous emotion in a society built on control, hierarchy, and the brutal calculus of survival. To fall deeply in love, to surrender to genuine passion, would have been an act of profound vulnerability, inviting exploitation, shame, or bitter disappointment. Your body, your desires, your very self, would inevitably be crushed under the weight of societal expectation, religious dogma, and the relentless demands of procreation and power. The conflict was inescapable. The resolution almost always a form of humiliation or bitter survival. So, as we emerge from this dark dive into the ancient Nile, remember this: the serene, romantic images you've been fed are a lie. The real story is far messier, far more grotesque, and utterly devoid of anything resembling a happily ever after. It's a tale of bodies, blood, and power, of desires warped by duty, and of lives consumed by the relentless, grinding machinery of a civilization obsessed with legacy, even at the cost of its own humanity. The legacy of lust and dust remains, a chilling monument to the enduring cycles of human power and its brutal assertion over the most intimate aspects of our lives. The silence, the lack of recorded personal sentiment, speaks volumes. The only thing left to do is acknowledge the horrifying truth and perhaps be grateful for the small comforts of your own messy, imperfect, but at least somewhat autonomous existence.